The business-class cabin reeked of expensive cologne and judgment. Connor Walsh clutched his 8-year-old son Dylan's small hand as passengers stared at their faded clothes and duct-taped backpack. "I'm sorry, sir." The flight attendant's voice dripped with condescension as she examined their boarding passes. 12F is business class. There must be some mistake." Her painted smile never reached her eyes. The woman in the Chanel suit whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why are they in here?" Connor's weathered hands trembled slightly as he touched the military envelope hidden in his jacket pocket. Dylan's innocent voice cut through the tension. "Dad, why are they looking at us funny?" But when 3 F-22 Raptors suddenly thundered alongside their commercial aircraft in perfect formation, and the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom requesting permission to honor someone called Midnight Viper on board, every whisper in that cabin died. Connor's face went ashen, because those fighter jets knew exactly who was sitting in seat 12F. Connor guided Dylan past disapproving stares, while expensive perfume mixed with judgment hung thick in the recycled air. Other passengers clutched their designer handbags closer, as if poverty might be contagious. "Last-minute upgrade, due to overbooking." Connor's voice remained steady despite the tremor in his hands. The flight attendant's name tag read Stephanie, and her expression suggested she'd rather be serving actual paying customers. "Well, please ensure your child doesn't disturb other passengers." She sniffed. Dylan's worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as they found their seats. "Dad, this is fancy," Dylan whispered, his small voice carrying wonder despite the hostile atmosphere. Connor forced a smile, the same one he'd perfected during 3 years of struggling alone. "Some people judge by appearance, buddy. We know who we are," he said quietly. But his fingers found the crumpled military envelope in his jacket pocket, feeling the weight of secrets buried deeper than any grave. Dylan looked up with confusion clouding his young features, sensing undercurrents he couldn't understand. The careful anonymity Connor had built over 3 years pressed against his chest like a physical burden. The businessman in seat 11A made no effort to lower his voice as he spoke into his phone. "Probably using stolen miles or welfare benefits. Security these days is pathetic." His cologne was as overpowering as his arrogance, filling the space with assumptions and privilege. Connor's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest, muscle memory keeping his breathing controlled. Dylan tugged on his father's sleeve with small fingers. "Dad, what are welfare benefits?" The innocent question hung in the air like an accusation, drawing more stares from passengers who seemed entertained by their discomfort. Stephanie returned with her practiced smile, carrying a tablet and barely concealed irritation. "Sir, we actually have some lovely seats available in economy class. Might be more comfortable for your family situation." The pause before comfortable spoke volumes about what she really meant. Connor's voice remained level, each word carefully measured. "We're fine here, thank you." Her smile faltered, revealing irritation beneath her professional mask. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, hanging between them like smoke from a distant battlefield. The woman in the Chanel suit leaned across the aisle, diamonds catching overhead light like tiny weapons. "Excuse me, but some of us pay premium prices to avoid this situation." Her voice carried authority of someone accustomed to having complaints heard immediately. Connor turned to face her, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "My son and I have every right to be here," he said quietly, each word carrying controlled fury. The woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for water, unused to being challenged by someone she'd classified as inferior. Dylan tugged on Connor's sleeve, his small face creased with worry. "Dad, maybe we should sit in the back. I don't want people to be upset." The innocence in his voice cut deeper than any insult. Connor knelt beside his son's seat, weathered hands gentle despite their obvious strength. Dylan, we belong exactly where we are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But the military envelope seemed to burn against his chest, a reminder of the man he used to be. Before life stripped away everything except what mattered most, before Rebecca died and priorities changed forever. Turbulence hit without warning, violent enough to send oxygen masks dropping like yellow flowers of panic. Screams echoed through the cabin as the aircraft bucked and rolled, tossing passengers against their restraints. The businessman gripped his armrests with white knuckles, face the color of old newspaper. The Chanel woman's makeup ran in dark streams as she sobbed into her mask, but Connor moved with supernatural precision, securing Dylan's mask before helping the elderly passenger across the aisle. His movements told a story his modest words never would. These were instincts of someone who'd faced death in the sky and lived. "Sir, you seem to know emergency procedures?" The old man gasped gratefully. "Some training," Connor replied simply, but his actions spoke differently. The way he checked mask seals, monitored breathing patterns, directed attention away from panic. Dylan watched his father with new awareness, seeing something in those weathered features he'd never noticed before, something that spoke of capabilities hidden beneath their ordinary life. Stephanie observed Connor's competence during crisis, her earlier condescension giving way to professional curiosity mixed with growing respect. The turbulence subsided, leaving the cabin filled with nervous laughter and lingering fear. Something had changed in the dynamic between passengers. Those who'd been quick to judge now avoided Connor's eyes, perhaps recognizing their assumptions had been built on sand. The businessman quietly pocketed his phone, earlier bravado replaced by uncomfortable silence. Stephanie's attitude shifted as she witnessed Connor's calm authority under pressure. The passengers who'd dismissed them now found themselves questioning their own character when faced with genuine capability and grace. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom with news that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a minor mechanical issue, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Andrews Air Force Base for inspection. We anticipate approximately 1 hour on the ground." The announcement drew groans from passengers worried about delays, but Connor's reaction was different. His face went pale, hand instinctively moving to the envelope. Through the window, military hangars came into view, their familiar shapes stirring memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Dylan pressed his face against the window as they descended, excitement cutting through tension. "Dad, look! Fighter jets!" His small finger traced aircraft on the distant runway, sleek forms barely visible in afternoon haze. Connor followed his son's gaze, something flickering across his features. Recognition, longing, and something that might have been pain. "They're beautiful," Dylan whispered, voice filled with wonder. "Yes," Connor replied quietly, his voice carrying undertones his son was too young to understand. "They are beautiful." The aircraft touched down with barely a bump, testament to pilot skill and military precision. As they taxied toward the terminal, Connor's hands began to shake. Not with fear, but with weight of memories threatening to surface after 3 years of careful burial. Other passengers remained absorbed in phones or complaints about delays, but Connor's attention was fixed on something outside. Through the window, 3 figures in flight suits approached with purposeful strides unmistakable to anyone who'd served. His breathing became shallow as recognition dawned. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss, and Major Lisa Chen stepped aboard. Her helmet tucked under one arm, authority radiating from every line of her compact frame. Dark eyes scanned the business-class cabin with military precision, taking in expensive clothes, designer luggage, faces unaccustomed to having assumptions challenged. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice carried command presence that made colonels stand straighter. "We're here to honor call sign Midnight Viper, who we understand is aboard this flight." The words hung in air like a challenge, carrying weight that transformed the cabin's atmosphere from irritation to electric attention. Silence followed, absolute and profound, broken only by a whisper of recycled air and distant jet engines. Passengers looked around with confusion and curiosity, delayed flights forgotten in face of unexpected military drama. Dylan tugged on his father's sleeve, young voice carrying clearly in quiet cabin. "Dad, what's a call sign?" But Connor couldn't answer, couldn't move. He could only stare at the woman in flight suit who'd just shattered 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity. Words that carried weight of his entire former life, everything he'd walked away from to become the father Dylan needed. Major Chen's gaze moved methodically through the cabin like a searchlight, trained eyes dismissing obviously civilian passengers one by one. Her attention lingered on Connor for a moment, something in his stillness catching her notice. But she moved on without immediate recognition, continuing systematic survey of confused faces. The businessman cleared his throat importantly, hoping to insert himself into whatever drama was unfolding. "I think there might be some mistake, officer. We're all civilians here." His voice carried condescension of someone accustomed to being most important person in any room. But Major Chen's expression didn't change, professional composure unshaken by civilian presumption. "Sir, would the person known as Midnight Viper please identify yourself?" Major Chen's voice carried across the cabin like a military challenge, each word precisely enunciated and impossible to ignore. The Chanel woman leaned forward eagerly, earlier tears forgotten in face of unexpected entertainment. Other passengers whispered among themselves, speculation running wild about who might be connected to military operations. But Connor remained frozen, weathered hands gripping armrests as if they were only things keeping him anchored to his carefully constructed reality. The weight of unspoken truths and guarded secrets suddenly seemed impossible to maintain under this direct scrutiny. Dylan looked up at his father with eyes reflecting confusion and growing pride, emotions warring in young features. "Dad?" The single word carried weight far beyond its simplicity, a question demanding an answer Connor wasn't ready to give. Silence stretched like taut wire under increasing tension, filled with weight of hidden truths demanding acknowledgement. Every eye in the cabin focused on unfolding drama, earlier judgments forgotten in face of revelation that promised to rewrite everything they thought they understood. The moment stretched until it became unbearable, heavy with expectation and carefully guarded secrets that could no longer remain hidden. Connor's hand moved involuntarily to the envelope in his pocket, fingers tracing familiar outline of pilot wings through worn fabric. Major Chen's eyes followed the movement with sharp attention, professional instincts recognizing something significant in the gesture. "Sir," she said, directing full attention to Connor for the first time, voice carrying new respect and growing recognition. The businessman's snicker died as he noticed the sudden shift in military officer's demeanor. Connor slowly raised his eyes to meet Major Chen's gaze, and in that moment, recognition flashed between them like lightning across clear sky. Her posture shifted imperceptibly, years of training warring with genuine surprise. "Captain Walsh?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, carrying weight of reputation and respect that transcended rank. The cabin erupted in confused whispers as passengers tried to process this unexpected development. "Former captain." Connor's voice was barely above a whisper, each word carrying weight of choices made and paths abandoned. "I've been out for 3 years. But even as he spoke, his bearing began to change. The careful slouch of a man trying to blend in gave way to something more fundamental. Military bearing wasn't something that could be completely erased, only hidden beneath layers of civilian life and deliberate obscurity. "Sir!" Major Chen snapped to attention with precision that would have made drill sergeants weep, her salute crisp and unwavering. The sound of heels clicking together echoed through cabin like gunshots, causing several passengers to jump. "Major Lisa Chen, 1st Fighter Wing. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Her voice carried reverence that transformed cabin atmosphere completely, turning skepticism into stunned silence. The businessman's mouth hung open, earlier arrogance replaced by confusion and dawning realization that he'd badly misjudged the situation. His expensive suit suddenly felt like costume jewelry in presence of genuine heroism. 2 more pilots entered the aircraft with movements speaking of confidence earned through facing death at 30,000 feet. Captain Rodriguez moved with swagger of someone who'd survived situations that would break lesser men. Lieutenant Barnes followed with bearing of youth, tempered by training beyond his years. Both men took one look at Major Chen's rigid posture and immediately snapped to attention themselves, training overriding confusion about unusual circumstances. The transformation in cabin atmosphere was electric, charged with military precision and respect that cut through civilian assumptions like a knife. Some truths couldn't be hidden once properly illuminated. "Holy shit!" Captain Rodriguez breathed, then caught himself with visible embarrassment. "Sorry, sir. Captain Miguel Rodriguez, 427th Fighter Squadron." His voice carried genuine excitement, enthusiasm usually reserved for meeting childhood heroes. "You saved my wingman over Syria in 2018. Jackson owes his life to your instruction." The words hung in air like incense, transforming Connor from object of derision to something approaching legend in space of heartbeats. Dylan stared up at his father with eyes wide as dinner plates, young mind struggling to process this sudden transformation that rewrote everything he thought he knew. "Dad?" The word carried wonder and confusion in equal measure, spoken by a boy who thought he understood everything about the man who'd raised him alone. Connor's weathered hand found his son's smaller one, calluses earned from manual labor, telling a story that suddenly seemed incomplete. "Dylan, there are things about Daddy's old job that I haven't told you," he said quietly, voice carrying weight of secrets finally coming to light. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, depending on what happened in next crucial minutes. The careful compartmentalization of his life was crumbling under pressure of circumstances beyond his control. Lieutenant Barnes stepped forward with movements speaking of youth and earnest dedication. "Sir, you probably don't remember, but you pulled my aircraft out of a flat spin during training exercise in 2019. I wouldn't be standing here without your instruction." His voice carried genuine gratitude of someone who'd stared death in face and been given second chance. The cabin had become completely silent, passengers hanging on every word as they witnessed something they'd never expected to see. Even Stephanie had stopped pretending to work, attention captured by unfolding drama that promised to redefine everything she thought she understood about service and sacrifice. Major Chen addressed the cabin with authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're in presence of one of finest pilots in Air Force history." Her words carried weight of absolute conviction, each syllable precisely chosen for maximum impact. Captain Walsh led a rescue mission into hostile territory deemed impossible by command. He brought home 6 downed airmen and his entire squadron without losing a single aircraft. The businessman's face flushed red as he realized magnitude of his earlier misjudgment. His expensive suit suddenly felt like costume jewelry in presence of genuine heroism. His throat worked silently as he struggled to find adequate words. "Additionally," Major Chen continued, voice carrying across cabin like battlefield citation, "Captain Walsh revolutionized combat training protocols during his 17-year career. He's directly responsible for preparing over 200 pilots currently serving worldwide." The Chanel woman's diamonds seemed to lose their sparkle compared to quiet dignity radiating from the man she'd dismissed so casually. Her perfectly manicured hands twisted in her lap as she struggled with realization that her prejudices had been built on foundations of ignorance rather than knowledge. Some assumptions crumbled when faced with uncomfortable truths about character and sacrifice that challenged comfortable worldviews. Captain Rodriguez pulled out worn flight log, pages yellow with age and marked with years of service. "Sir, would you please sign this? I've carried it since Syria mission as reminder of what leadership looks like under pressure." His request carried reverence of pilgrim asking for blessing, transforming simple autograph into something approaching religious experience. Connor hesitated, eyes moving between hopeful pilot and his son's wondering face. "I don't really do that anymore," he said quietly, voice carrying reluctance born from 3 years of deliberate anonymity. But Dylan tugged on his sleeve with insistence only 8-year-olds could muster when they believed something important was at stake. "Dad, you should sign it. If you helped people, that's good, right?" The innocence in his voice cut through years of carefully constructed barriers like sword through silk. Connor took the pen with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from weight of memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. As he signed his name with careful precision, Major Chen provided commentary that transformed their understanding of the man they'd dismissed. Midnight Viper earned his call sign during night rescue operation in 2017. Captain Walsh flew through thunderstorm with 0 visibility to guide lost patrol home. Command had written them off as casualties, but he brought every single man back alive. "Why'd you leave?" Lieutenant Barnes asked with directness that characterized military communication, question cutting straight to heart of what everyone wondered. Connor glanced at Dylan, whose young face reflected mixture of pride and confusion that made his heart ache. "My wife got sick. Priorities changed," he said simply, but statement carried years of sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and kind of love that could make a man walk away from everything he'd worked for. Major Chen nodded with understanding that came from serving alongside other warriors who'd made similar sacrifices. Some choices required abandoning everything except what mattered most when life demanded impossible decisions. Stephanie approached with entirely different demeanor, earlier condescension replaced by something approaching reverence mixed with genuine shame. "Captain Walsh, I owe you sincere apology. I didn't realize who you were or what you'd sacrificed." Her voice trailed off as she struggled to find words adequate for magnitude of her misjudgment. Connor's response carried grace of someone who'd learned that holding grudges was luxury he couldn't afford. "You couldn't have known my background," he said gently, voice holding no anger or accusation. Just quiet dignity of someone who'd made peace with being underestimated and judged by appearances rather than actions that defined character under pressure. The woman in Chanel suit rose from her seat with movements that seemed to require tremendous effort, earlier arrogance replaced by shame that made designer clothes look shabby. "I'm Patricia Morrison," she said, extending manicured hand that trembled slightly. "I owe you sincere apology for my inexcusable behavior." But Connor didn't take her hand immediately, steady gaze holding her accountable without cruelty. "No apology necessary," he said finally. "You showed who you are when you thought it didn't matter." The words hung between them like judgment that couldn't be appealed, carrying more weight than any raised voice or angry confrontation could achieve. The businessman cleared his throat awkwardly, earlier bravado completely evaporated like morning mist. "Perhaps I misjudged the situation rather badly," he offered weakly, expensive watch suddenly seeming like cheap jewelry compared to quiet strength radiating from Connor. Connor's response was measured and final, delivered without malice, but with finality that made further discussion pointless. "Perhaps you did," he said simply, 2 words carrying weight of absolute judgment delivered without emotion. Some lessons could only be learned through experiencing their full consequences, when comfortable assumptions collided with uncomfortable truths about character and moral courage. Major Chen checked her watch with precision of someone whose life was governed by schedules and duty. "Sir, we need to depart, but there's situation developing that requires your expertise. Pentagon's been trying to reach you through old channels." Her words carried implications that made Connor's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I'm retired from active service," he said firmly, but statement lacked conviction it might have carried just minutes before. "New threat level requiring experienced pilots for advisory roles, especially someone with your specific training background." The weight of unfinished business hung between them like smoke from battlefield that had never really ended. Dylan looked between adults with acute perception that children possessed, sensing undercurrents he couldn't fully understand but recognizing as important to their future. "Dad, are you really hero like they say?" The question hung in air like challenge, carrying with it years of carefully constructed normal life that suddenly seemed built on foundations of concealment rather than privacy. Captain Rodriguez answered before Connor could respond, voice carrying conviction that transformed Dylan's understanding of his father from mechanic to mythical figure in space of single heartbeat. "Your dad is legend, son. Stories about Midnight Viper are required reading in flight school." The words carried weight that transcended simple praise to become something approaching prophecy. Major Chen handed Connor a card with movements that suggested gesture carried significance beyond simple contact information. "No pressure, sir, but if you change your mind, country could use you again in ways that honor both your expertise and family responsibilities." The weight of duty and service hung between them like unspoken obligation, carrying knowledge that some responsibilities transcended personal choice when national security and young lives hung in balance. Connor took the card with fingers that seemed reluctant to make contact, as if touching it might somehow drag him back into a world he'd deliberately left behind for love and family responsibility. As pilots prepared to leave, Major Chen turned to Dylan with a smile that transformed her stern features. "Your father is finest pilot I've ever known, and I've served alongside the best. You should be proud of him every single day." Her words carried authority of someone who'd served alongside genuine heroes and could recognize excellence when encountered in unexpected places. "I am proud," Dylan replied firmly, small voice carrying conviction that surprised adults around him. "Even before I knew about flying stuff, I was proud because he's my dad and he takes care of me no matter what happens." After pilots departed, cabin atmosphere had changed completely and permanently, transformed from hostility to something approaching reverence mixed with embarrassment from people who'd revealed more about their character than intended. Passengers who'd ignored or dismissed Connor now stole glances filled with respect rather than disdain, whispered conversations carrying admiration instead of judgment. The businessman worked quietly at his laptop, earlier bravado completely absent as he struggled to process magnitude of his misjudgment. Some revelations forced uncomfortable examination of assumptions that had seemed solid just hours before, but now appeared built on prejudice rather than wisdom. Stephanie returned with complimentary drinks and attention that bordered on fawning, earlier hostility completely replaced by eager service that carried genuine respect. "Can I get anything else for you, Captain Walsh? Anything at all?" she asked, voice carrying respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Just Connor, please," he replied gently, insistence on simplicity in face of newfound reverence, speaking to character forged by something more fundamental than public recognition. "And we're fine, thank you." The flight attendant's relief was palpable, but her new understanding had permanently altered dynamic between them in ways that couldn't be undone or forgotten by either party. Dylan processed everything with remarkable resilience that characterized childhood, young mind working to reconcile new information with everything he thought he knew about his father. "Dad, Why didn't you tell me about being pilot and saving people? The question carried hurt, but not accusation, spoken by a boy who trusted his father's judgment even when he didn't understand reasoning behind difficult decisions. Connor's response came from years of careful consideration about what children needed to know and when they were ready to handle complex truths about duty and sacrifice. Because being your father is more important than being pilot or anything else I've ever done. But you were saving people and doing important things. Dylan's protest carried moral clarity that only children possessed, cutting through adult complexities to reach fundamental truths about service and responsibility. Connor's smile held years of sleepless nights and difficult decisions made in hospital rooms when duty to family trumped duty to country. I save one person now, he said gently, hand finding Dylan's and holding it with strength that spoke of absolute commitment. You are most important mission I've ever had, and I complete it successfully every single day. The words carried conviction that made everyone within hearing understand that some forms of heroism happened in daily choices rather than dramatic gestures captured in news reports. Patricia Morrison approached hesitantly, earlier arrogance replaced by genuine remorse that made expensive clothes seem shabby compared to Connor's simple dignity. Mr. Walsh, I want to sincerely apologize for my inexcusable behavior and cruel things I said. Her words carried weight of someone confronting ugly reality of their own prejudices. Connor studied her face with eyes that had seen best and worst of human nature in situations where character emerged under pressure. We all make judgments based on incomplete information, he said thoughtfully. Question is what we do after we learn we were wrong and have opportunity to make better choices going forward. I'd like to make substantial donation to military families' charity in your name, she offered, voice carrying desperate hope of someone seeking to transform embarrassment into meaningful action. Connor's response carried wisdom of someone who'd learned that true apologies required acknowledging harm done to innocent people rather than seeking personal absolution. Make the donation in Dylan's name, he said firmly. He's the one who had to hear your comments and assumptions about our worth as human beings. The redirection transformed her gesture from self-serving penance into genuine acknowledgement of harm done to child who'd done nothing to deserve such treatment. As flight resumed toward original destination, Connor found himself caught between worlds that suddenly seemed impossible to reconcile without fundamental changes to their carefully ordered life. Passengers approached throughout remainder of journey with requests and stories that chipped away at careful anonymity he'd constructed over 3 years. A veteran thanked him with tears in his eyes. Elderly man shared stories of his son whose life had been saved by Connor's training methods. Children sought autographs with wide-eyed wonder that transformed simple signatures into treasured possessions. Each interaction revealed the man beneath mechanics' coveralls and legend behind father's gentle hands. Dylan watched his father handle attention with quiet grace that spoke to character forged by years of genuine service rather than pursuit of recognition. Dad, were you famous before? He whispered during brief lull in parade of well-wishers. Connor's response carried humility of someone who understood difference between notoriety and significance, between public recognition and private satisfaction that came from work well done. Not famous in way movie stars are famous, he explained carefully. Just good at job that mattered to people's safety and survival. But even as he spoke these modest words, his eyes carried weight of memories that suggested his job had involved responsibilities most people could never imagine. Landing at Reagan National felt like stepping into a different world, one where Connor's carefully constructed anonymity had been permanently shattered and could never be rebuilt. As passengers deplaned, several stopped to shake his hand with reverence, usually reserved for meeting genuine heroes whose actions had shaped history. Patricia Morrison left her business card with offer that carried genuine commitment born from shame and desire to make meaningful amends. If you ever need anything for Dylan's education, activities, or future opportunities, please contact me, she said with sincerity that suggested her earlier behavior had taught important lessons about cost of judging people by appearances rather than character. In terminal, Connor's phone buzzed with missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, area codes that suggested official interest he'd hoped to avoid forever. The weight of his former life pressed against carefully constructed present like water against weakening dam, threatening to flood everything he'd built in 3 years of deliberate obscurity. Dylan gripped his father's hand tighter as they navigated through crowds that suddenly seemed filled with potential complications rather than simple travelers. His young instincts recognized that their carefully ordered world was about to change in fundamental ways that couldn't be controlled or predicted with any certainty. "Sir?" The voice behind them carried authority that made Connor's shoulders tense with recognition even before he turned around. General Patricia Hayes stood in civilian clothes that couldn't completely hide her military bearing, flanked by 2 aides whose alert postures suggested this wasn't social encounter. "General Hayes," Connor said, recognition immediate and carrying years of professional respect mixed with personal wariness. The woman before him held power to reshape his carefully ordered life with single phone call or official request that would be difficult to refuse without serious consequences for national security and innocent lives that hung in balance. "Connor," she said, use of first name suggesting familiarity that transcended military protocol. "We need to talk about developments that require your immediate attention." The simple statement carried implications that made Connor's protective instincts flare immediately. Dylan sensed tension in adult voices with intuitive fear that children possessed when their security felt threatened by forces beyond understanding. "General, I'm flattered, but I'm out of active service permanently," Connor replied with finality, forged by 3 years of deliberate choice and careful commitment to priorities that transcended military obligation when family needs came first, without question or hesitation. "Walk with me for just few minutes," General Hayes suggested, tone carrying authority that made refusal seem impossible even for someone of Connor's stature. They moved to quiet corner where conversation could remain private, despite crowds surrounding them. Her expression carried gravity that suggested weight of classified information and national security implications, rather than simple military courtesy. Dylan remained close to his father, sensing undercurrents he couldn't understand, but instinctively distrusting any force that might separate him from only parent he had left in world that suddenly seemed less predictable and secure than it had been just hours before. 3 weeks ago, major cyber attack hit Air Force training systems with unprecedented sophistication, General Hayes began, words carrying implications that made Connor's blood run cold. "Flight simulators compromised, training protocols corrupted in subtle ways that create fatal errors under combat conditions. We've had 6 near misses with newly graduated pilots in situations that should have been routine." The information hung between them like ticking bomb, carrying knowledge that young lives hung in balance of decisions that would be made in next crucial minutes. Connor listened with focused attention of someone whose training had never completely left him, despite 3 years of deliberate civilian life. "Someone systematically targeting our pilot preparation programs with surgical precision," General continued, voice carrying weight of classified briefings and sleepless nights. "Making subtle changes that aren't immediately detectable, but sufficient to create fatal errors in real combat situations, where split-second decisions mean difference between life and death." The implications were staggering, suggesting enemy that understood American military training well enough to corrupt it from within using knowledge that should have been secure and compartmentalized. Connor's mind began analyzing patterns and possibilities with systematic approach that had made him legendary among peers for solving complex problems under pressure. That's absolutely insidious. Connor said quietly, already beginning to grasp full scope of threat they were facing. It gets worse, General Hayes replied grimly. We suspect inside job by someone with intimate knowledge of training methodology you developed between 2015 and 2022. Your specific innovations are being systematically corrupted and turned into weapons against very pilots they were designed to protect. The words hit Connor like physical blows, carrying realization that his life's work was being used as weapon against people he'd spent career trying to protect and prepare for survival in hostile environments that demanded split-second decisions based on sound training. Dylan tugged on Connor's sleeve with insistence that only 8-year-olds could muster when they sensed important conversations that might affect their security. "Dad, what's sabotage?" The question highlighted innocence that Connor had worked so hard to preserve. Childhood that existed in careful isolation from complexities of military service and national security threats. Connor knelt to his son's level, weathered hands gentle despite their obvious strength and weight of decisions that would reshape their entire future. Someone is hurting good people by breaking things they need to stay safe while doing dangerous work. Connor explained with careful honesty that characterized his approach to difficult topics children needed to understand without being overwhelmed. Like if someone broke firefighters' ladder so they couldn't rescue people from burning buildings? Dylan asked, his analogy carrying moral clarity that children possessed when reducing complex situations to fundamental questions of right and wrong. Exactly like that, Connor confirmed, but his eyes remained fixed on General Hayes as she delivered information that would force him to choose between life he'd built and responsibilities he'd never completely abandoned. The weight of other people's children hung between them like unspoken obligation that transcended personal preference when lives hung in balance of decisions that could only be made by people with specific expertise and proven judgment under extreme pressure. Dylan considered information with seriousness that characterized his approach to adult problems requiring moral judgment. Are pilots crashing because someone broke their training? The question cut straight to heart of what everyone was thinking, but afraid to voice directly. Connor looked at General Hayes, whose slight nod confirmed fears that made his protective instincts war with sense of duty to something larger than personal preference. Some are in danger, and more will be if we don't find a way to stop whoever is doing this, he admitted quietly, words carrying weight that seemed to age him visibly in space of few heartbeats. Then you should help them, Dad, Dylan said with moral certainty that only children possessed, young voice carrying conviction that cut through years of careful rationalization and deliberate distance from military service. Because if you can fix broken training, then pilots won't crash, and their families won't be sad like we were when Mommy died. The innocence in his words highlighted fundamental choice that lay before them, between personal safety and public responsibility, between Father Connor had chosen to become and pilot he'd never completely stopped being, despite 3 years of determined civilian life that had become their foundation for everything else that mattered. General Hayes watched this exchange with professional interest that suggested she understood family dynamics at play better than Connor might have preferred. It would mean leaving your home for approximately 2 weeks while we investigate and rebuild compromised systems, she explained carefully, voice carrying acknowledgement of sacrifice that military families made daily when duty called at inconvenient times. Will I be with Dad the whole time? Dylan asked with directness that reflected their close relationship and his need for security in uncertain world. Every single day, Connor promised. But even as he spoke, he could feel weight of commitments that might prove impossible to keep in face of national security requirements. Then it's okay with me, Dylan said simply, his trust in Father's judgment absolute despite uncertainty that surrounded their future. Mommy always said we should help people when we can, especially when we're only ones who know how to fix what's broken. The reference to Rebecca carried years of conversations about duty and service that Connor thought his son had been too young to remember. General Hayes observed this exchange with recognition of moment when personal conviction aligned with national necessity to create possibilities that hadn't existed minutes before. Some decisions could only be made when all factors finally came together in perfect alignment of duty and family responsibility. "General, what aren't you telling me about this situation?" Connor asked with directness that carried years of experience, with military briefings that revealed information gradually. General Hayes exchanged glances with her aides in silent communication that suggested conversation was about to enter territory requiring even greater discretion. "We believe Saboteur is specifically targeting protocols you developed, with intimate knowledge of your training philosophy that shouldn't be available to outside actors." She continued grimly. "Your training methods are being systematically corrupted by someone who understands them well enough to turn your innovations into weapons against very pilots they were designed to protect. This is personal rather than just professional," Connor said, statement carrying understanding that some conflicts transcended disagreement about training methodology to become matters of fundamental worldview and personal animosity. "Very personal," General Hayes confirmed with gravity that made Connor's protective instincts flare with immediate concern for Dylan's safety. Connor's jaw tightened as pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity that left no room for doubt about personal nature of threat they were facing. "Someone with access to my methods, my psychology, my training philosophy, and years of close collaboration," he said, voice carrying recognition that betrayal often came from those closest to work rather than distant enemies. "You've been watching me and my family," Connor stated flatly, voice carrying accusation and understanding that privacy had been illusion that never really protected anyone. "Protecting you," General Hayes corrected with emphasis that suggested distinction was important. "Connor, whoever's doing this views you as threat to their operation because your reputation and methods represent everything they're trying to discredit and destroy." Dylan looked between adults with perception that made Connor realize his son understood more about their situation than anyone had intended to reveal. "Dad, are bad people trying to hurt you because you're good at teaching pilots?" The question cut straight to heart of fears Connor had hoped to keep hidden from his son forever. Connor's protective instincts warred with honesty that his son deserved as they prepared to make decisions that would affect both their futures. "General, I won't put my son at risk by accepting this assignment," Connor stated with finality that carried weight of absolute priority and non-negotiable commitment to protecting only family he had left. On base, he'd be safer than anywhere else with full security and best schools designed for military families. She replied, understanding of military life offering advantages that civilian existence couldn't provide when facing threats that required institutional protection rather than individual vigilance that could only go so far against determined enemies. "And if I refuse this request?" Connor asked, though his expression suggested he already knew answer wouldn't provide kind of security he wanted for family's future. "Then good pilots continue dying from sabotaged training protocols, and eventually this person escalates to direct attacks on you and anyone they perceive as supporting your work," General Hayes replied with brutal honesty that made clear choice wasn't really between safety and danger, but between facing threat actively or waiting for it to find them in an environment where they had less support and fewer resources for protection against someone motivated by personal hatred rather than professional disagreement. Connor realized terrible choice before him wasn't really choice at all. Engage with institutional support and risk Dylan's safety in controlled environment, or stay hidden and allow others to suffer consequences of his avoidance while eventually facing same threats without military protection. Dad. Dylan said quietly, young voice cutting through adult deliberations with moral clarity that couldn't be ignored. "Remember what you told me about bullies at school? Sometimes you have to stand up to them even when it's scary, because hiding just makes them hurt more people and eventually they come after you anyway." Connor looked down at his son and saw Rebecca's courage reflected in those young eyes. Same moral certainty that had made her support his military service, despite risks it entailed. 2 weeks maximum," Connor finally said, words carrying weight that would reshape their carefully ordered life. "But Dylan's safety is absolutely non-negotiable under any circumstances." General Hayes nodded with understanding that came from dealing with military families who faced similar choices daily, when duty conflicted with personal preference and family security seemed threatened by larger obligations that couldn't be ignored without serious consequences for innocent people who depended on their expertise and moral courage. 6 months later, small airfield outside Washington revealed how they'd found balance between service and family that had seemed impossible during his active duty years, but proved sustainable when approached with wisdom gained through experience and loss. Connor wore instructor's jacket as he watched young pilots practice takeoffs with precision that reflected training protocols cleansed of corruption and restored to original effectiveness through painstaking investigation and rebuilding efforts. Dylan stood beside him wearing miniature assistant instructor badge with pride that showed his understanding of their work had grown to include genuine contribution rather than simple observation of adult activities that he couldn't fully comprehend or appreciate. Morrison's arrest during carefully orchestrated symposium had led to evidence revealing conspiracy spanning 2 years and involving systematic efforts to discredit human-centered training in favor of automated systems that would have made military aviation less effective and more dangerous. Connor's testimony had helped convict Morrison and reform military training protocols nationwide, but more importantly, it had allowed him to reconcile service with fatherhood in ways that honored both responsibilities without requiring him to choose between them at cost of either effectiveness or family stability that Dylan needed for healthy development in an uncertain world. The work continued with sustainable rhythm that proved some forms of service could enhance, rather than threaten family bonds when approached with wisdom and proper priorities. Connor called instructions to student pilots, while Dylan documented each flight with seriousness that reflected their shared commitment to aviation safety. Their Saturday routine of civilian flight instruction allowed Connor to share expertise while maintaining family-centered life that had become their foundation for everything else that mattered. This balance between service and personal responsibility had proven sustainable precisely because it honored both obligations without requiring sacrifice of either effectiveness or family presence that remained their highest priority. As they drove home through familiar suburban streets that had become their sanctuary, Connor reflected on how authenticity had proven more sustainable than concealment, how service could multiply love rather than competing with it for time and attention. Their story continued, not with dramatic conclusions, but with daily choices that honored both their past and future, both Connor's individual capabilities and their shared commitment to values that transcended any single accomplishment or recognition. Some legacies are written not in stone, but in daily choices that touch other lives, in wisdom shared through patient teaching, in children who learn that helping others enhances rather than diminishes family bonds that provide foundation for all other meaningful service that makes life worth living and builds better world for future generations.